Hi friends, welcome to our fourth video for Unit 2. This is our first video talking about the brain. The brain is going to be broken down into two videos. This first one is going to be about the older parts of the brain, and then our second video will be about the newer, more evolved parts of the brain. Okay, so you can see some of our learning targets for this part of the unit. You can see that we have a lot of learning targets that pertain to the brain. So hopefully we can notice that this part of the unit is very, very important, and we want to make sure that we know our different parts of the brain, the different functions, and all of the stuff that goes along with it. So take a moment, look through some of the learning targets and see all of the stuff that we're going to cover. Like I said, it's going to be split up into two videos. So this first video is going to cover some of the learning targets, and the second video is going to cover the rest. So the first section, we're going to talk about the bottom part of the brain, and that's called the brainstem, up to the middle part of the brain, which is literally in the middle of your brain. These are more of our primitive parts of the brain that we share along with other animals, other mammals. Like if we were dissecting our sheep's brains like we normally do in a traditional setting, we would see the brainstem and the middle brain on the sheep. So before we even get into that, let's talk about different techniques of how to study the brain. So a lot of times we're going to look at brain lesions. So this is where part of the brain tissue is destroyed to study the behaviors of what happens after that part of the brain is destroyed. Most of this is done for experiments, and it's done for scientific and medical purposes. Now, sometimes these can happen naturally, like if someone has a stroke, we can still study that person's behavior after they've had their stroke and part of their brain has been damaged. And if a part of the brain ever has to be destroyed, it is for the goodness or the betterment of the person. So we're not just taking people off the street, destroying part of their brain. That's unethical. So let's look at the different types of brain scans. There's a lot of different ways that we can look at the brain and look at the brain activity. The first one that we're going to talk about is an EEG, and this is going to study the electrical waves that are happening across the brain surface. So you might hear the term brain waves. That's what we're talking about here. So if you see the picture of our dude that has all the little sticky things on his head, those are little electrodes, and they are stuck to his head to help monitor the activity in his brain by looking at those brain waves. And you can see in our other picture, this is an example of what those brain waves would look like that are being measured. The next one that we're going to look at is an MRI. It's probably the one that's the most well known. Some of you might have even had an MRI before. And we are going to use magnetic fields and radio waves to produce computer-generated images that distinguish among different types of brain tissue. So, like an X-ray allows us to see hard tissue and bones, and MRI is going to let us see that soft tissue. Now, there's another one that's similar. We have a functional MRI with that lowercase f in front. Now, this is going to measure something a little bit different. You're still going to be in that tube that they put you in for an MRI, but this is going to detect changes in the brain associated with brain flow. So when you're getting this done, the patient might have headphones on, might be looking at a screen, might be answering some questions. And as the patient is interacting with that information or answering those questions, the scan is going to show the brain activity happening by looking at the blood flow in different parts of the brain. So make sure you know the difference between MRI and functional MRI. The next scan that we're going to look at is our PET scan. And this is a process that we use to observe metabolic processes in the body and the brain. The patient is going to ingest a radioactive form of glucose, and then during the PET scan, there are pictures going to be taken of the brain and the body where that glucose is being highlighted. The next one that we're going to look at is a CAT scan or a CT scan. So my keyword for this one would be X-ray. It's going to combine a series of X-ray images that will allow us to look at the brain, for instance, at different angles and it creates kind of this cross-sectional imaging of the brain or any part of the body that we're looking at. So you can kind of see from the pictures on this slide that we're able to see different parts of the brain at different angles. So this would be like if you cut the top part of your head off, if you took that off and you were able to look straight down into your brain, you would be able to see your brain at that angle. And then you could also look at your brain or cut it up into different sections and then look at it from different angles. So that CT scan just allows you to look at the brain, kind of make it almost 3D and look at it from different angles to see what's happening. A lot of times you'll see CT scans used when we're trying to identify cancer in someone. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the different parts of the brain labeled. We're going to do a brief chat about each part of the brain, but we're going to go into more detail later. So let's talk about first the cerebral cortex. So that is kind of the squishy, mushy looking part of the brain. And that's when we look at the different lobes, we're going to be talking about the cerebral cortex. So we'll come back to that one. We have our corpus callosum. So if you look at this kind of archway, this band, this kind of thick curved area right there, that's the corpus callosum. And that is the part of the brain that connects the left hemisphere to the right hemisphere and allows for messages to be sent across hemispheres. So those neurons can send a message from the right hemisphere to the left and the left to the right. You have your cerebellum back here. Cerebellum means tiny brain, and that's what it looks like. It looks like a little brain back there, and its main function is to help you with balance, movement, and coordination. And coordination, sometimes we think of that as like athletic, and that's coordination for sure, but it's also coordination of small movements. So the fact that you can hold a pencil and write is a coordinated movement, and the cerebellum controls small coordinated movements and then big coordinated movements like standing on a balance beam or kicking a soccer ball. We have our thalamus. So this is this little blob, really, right here in the middle of the brain, sitting on top of the brainstem. The thalamus is like the switchboard for all of your sensory information. So information that comes in from your 5 senses gets sent to the thalamus, and then the thalamus decides which parts of the brain that information needs to get sent to. I like to think of it as like the airport of the brain. Like people come to the airport and then they leave and go to different terminals, and the different terminals take them to different places. So your thalamus is kind of like the airport in that way. So for example, if you're watching this video, you get that message that you're seeing something that gets sent to your optic nerve, and your optic nerve takes it to your thalamus, and then your thalamus is going to send that visual information to your occipital lobe, to that visual cortex, and so then you're aware that you are seeing something. So any information coming from your senses is going to get sent to the thalamus, and then the thalamus is going to send it to the correct parts of the brain. Then we have our hypothalamus. So that just means we're sitting under, hypo means under the thalamus. And this is going to be in control of our drives, and it's going to be a big part of the endocrine system, which you learned about in the last video. But any of your drives like hunger, thirst, body temperature, your sex drive, all of that is going to be controlled and regulated by the hypothalamus. And then below that, which kind of looks like a little bean, that's your pituitary gland, which we talked a lot about in the last video. Remember, that's the master gland that kind of controls all the different glands that release different hormones through our endocrine system. Next, we have the pons. This is going to be this circular oval blob. Keep calling them blobs, but that's really what they look like. Part of the brainstem, and this is going to regulate your sleep and allow you to go through your different sleep stages in your sleep cycles. This next section is the medulla oblongata. Sometimes we just call it the medulla, but this regulates your involuntary function, specifically your heartbeat. So if this gets destroyed, you die. Very unfortunate. And then the last part of the brainstem, and it's kind of hard to see on this picture, but we have our reticular activating systems, or our reticular formation. And that is going to be this band of fibers that run up and down the brainstem. And this monitors things like alertness and awakefulness. So your ability to wake up in the morning, or your ability to be alert, or when someone calls your name and that gets your attention, that is dedicated by your reticular formation. And then we have our spinal cord down here. You'll see that our brain stem is right on top of our spinal cord. They like flow together. So that's why that part of the body is very important, because as we learned in the past videos, neurons travel up and down the spinal cord from the spinal cord to the brain and send those messages. So if the brain is not attached to the spinal cord, those inner neurons can't move back and forth and do their job. So the pons, the medulla, the reticular formation, and a lot of times the cerebellum and the thalamus will be included in the brainstem, but those parts are the brainstem. For sure, pons, medulla, and reticular formation. A lot of times cerebellum and thalamus are going to be included in that as well. But this is the oldest part of the brain. The next part of the brain that we're going to talk about is the limbic system. So this is kind of considered your middle brain, but this is the part of the brain which is located on both sides of the thalamus, immediately beneath the temporal lobe, that control emotion, behavior, motivation, learning, and memory. So a lot of important things are happening here. So our main parts of our limbic system are going to be the hippocampus, the amygdala, and the hypothalamus. Those are our three friends, part of the limbic system. So let's look at this picture here. What are we looking at? So we see that the limbic system is kind of this C shape that goes around the thalamus, and it's attached to our temporal lobes, which we're going to learn about in the next video. But it goes around the thalamus. The thalamus is not part of the limbic system, nor is the cerebellum here, but we have it in the picture so you can see where the limbic system fits in. But we called it the middle brain because look, it's in the middle of the brain. So we have our amygdala, which is close to our hippocampus, and all of those fun things right there. So let's look at another perspective, and let's talk about what some of these parts of the limbic system do. So in this picture, we have our hypothalamus. We didn't see it in the last one, but we have that here. We know that that is a big player in the endocrine system and regulating those drives. We have our amygdala right here, and that is, it's involved with emotion, but mostly fear and aggression. So if this is damaged, this can damage your ability to feel afraid or feel aggression. And so there was a lady who went to go see the doctor who had her amygdala damaged, and he said something and she just became so outraged and wanted to fight him because her amygdala was damaged, so she wasn't able to regulate her emotions correctly. So in theory, also, if this is damaged in another way, you could potentially not feel afraid in stressful or dangerous situations. I heard a kid like to remember it because the first part of the word says Amy. They like to think of it as angry Amy, or Amy is angry, because the amygdala controls fear and aggression. The hippocampus, this is this pink part. It almost looks like a seahorse, and that's where that word comes from. And hippocampus controls learning new memories and short-term memories. So your ability to learn this information right now, you can thank your hippocampus for that. Another fun way to remember it that a student came up with was, if you see a hippo on campus, you're going to remember. And that helps you remember that your hippocampus is linked to learning new memories and your short-term memory. So if that's damaged, which I'll show you a video soon about a guy that his hippocampus was damaged, he wasn't able to remember any of the new memories that he made. And so he would forget things about 6 seconds later after he heard them. So he would be in the middle of a conversation and forget what they were talking about. So you really need your hippocampus. We have our corpus callosum right here. We kind of talked about that before, but that's a band of fibers that connect your hemispheres of your brain together, and they help. The corpus callosum is involved in kind of the same stuff that the limbic system is involved in, processing emotions, regulating behaviors, as well as autonomic motor functions. And then we also have our thalamus here, which we know not a part of the limbic system, but the limbic system goes around the thalamus. Okay, so in the next section, in the next video, we're going to be talking about those higher functioning areas of the brain, which is the cerebral cortex. We're going to break those down into different lobes and see what the different lobes do. So this is the part of the brain that sets us apart from all other species. So the older brain, aka the brainstem, and the middle brain, aka the limbic system, they are found in other species besides humans. But this part with the cerebral cortex is going to be significant to humans, and that's what sets us apart from other species. So look for that in our next video.